Madame et Monsieur, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the chair of the Donner Canadian Foundation, Mr. Ken White.
Greetings, everyone. On behalf of the Donner Canadian Foundation, I want to welcome you all to the presentation of the 2019-2020 Donner Prize. Normally, we'd be standing in the lovely Carlew Theatre in Toronto in front of over 200 people. Anxious finalists, nervous publishers, curious media, and dozens of friends of the prize. With the onset of COVID-19, however, we postponed the May presentation to the fall in hopes that we could still host our annual gala dinner. In this pandemic era, that's just not possible. So in the spirit of the show must go on, we're pleased to present this digital version of the awards. Some of you know the origins of the now 70-year-old Donner Canadian Foundation. William H. Donner, an American-born businessman and philanthropist, had spent much time in Canada, particularly in Montreal, where he befriended Dr. Wilder Penfield and helped him found the Montreal Neurological Institute. He created the Donner Canadian Foundation in 1950 with the goal of helping Canada build a better economy, a better society, and a better country. Since that time, the Donner Canadian Foundation has devoted $200 million to thousands of philanthropic projects in Canada. One of the motivating factors behind the creation of the Donner Prize was the force of nature that was then Donner Canadian Foundation Chair, Alan Gottlieb. After a remarkable career in public and private sectors, Alan was keenly aware of the need for quality public policy discourse. Unfortunately, Alan passed away in April of this year at age 92. We at the Donner Canadian Foundation and myself personally will miss his guidance, and we're pleased to share this homage to him.
Alan Gottlieb had a storied career. His accomplishments, influence, and his service over 7 decades distinguished him as one of Canada's leading citizens. Born in Winnipeg, he went on to receive an MA from Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. He received his Bachelor of Laws degree from Harvard, where he also edited the prestigious Harvard Law Review. In 1957, he joined the Department of External Affairs. By 1977, he was the Undersecretary of External Affairs, and in 1981, he became the Canadian Ambassador to the United States. During his 8 years as ambassador, his dazzling intellect, boundless energy, and endless curiosity gained Mr. Gottlieb a reputation as a skilled and respected player in Washington power politics, and built scores of relationships with the celebrated and powerful. Throughout his career as a civil servant and diplomat, his analytic nature and aptitude for fresh thinking pushed Mr. Gottlieb to be an agent of change. As Undersecretary of External Affairs, he reinvented the department as a more central part of the Government of Canada, and he changed the way Canada related to the United States, broadening diplomatic connections that had been focused on the State Department to include the powerful in the U.S. government. It was during his time as Canadian Ambassador, Mr. Gottlieb received the Order of Canada and was later elevated to Companion of the Order. When Mr. Gottlieb returned to Canada in early 1990, he continued to wield influence, this time in the private sector. Among his many endeavors, he was chairman of the Canada Council, publisher of Saturday Night Magazine, a member on a number of corporate boards, as well as chair of Sotheby's Canada, and senior business advisor and international law and diplomacy advisor at Bennett Jones Toronto. Alan Gottlieb's interests, accomplishments, and influences are extraordinary, and we were blessed that for the last 20 years, he used his relationships, his wealth of knowledge, experience, and insight in the service of the Donner Foundation. He joined the Board of Governors in 1994, became chairman of the Donner Foundation in 1996, and helped to shape and guide the foundation for 20 years as its longest-serving chairman. During his tenure and through his guidance and influence, the Donner Foundation has grown in size and prestige, as has the annual Donner Book Prize, now in its 22nd year, which was born directly out of the impetus of Mr. Gottlieb. Reflecting on the progress the Donner Foundation has made, Mr. Gottlieb said, "I think we have really made a difference with our focus on public policy and helping to create and support new think tanks. The difference we make is not in the sense of any particular public policy, but in the level of debate, research, and investigation of public policy alternatives. That is definitely personally gratifying for me. And gratifying for all those you have touched. We thank you, and we miss you."
With Alan's guidance, the Foundation created the Donner Prize for Public Policy Writing in 1998 to celebrate the best public policy books and showcase the best ideas addressing the many social, environmental, and economic challenges facing Canada. With a $50,000 purse for the winner and $7,500 for other finalists, this is one of the most lucrative prizes for nonfiction writing in Canada. And here are this year's finalists.
Introducing your Donner Prize shortlist for 2019-2020. Empty Planet, The Shock of Global Population Decline, written by Daryl Bricker and John Ibbotson, published by Signal, McClellan and Stewart. Empty Planet is a timely corrective to the general inattention to declining global population. Original, challenging, engagingly written, Empty Planet also touches on attendant issues of population decline, including impacts on religion, indigenous populations, and agriculture. Living with China, A Middle Power Finds Its Way, written by Wendy Dobson, published by Rotman UTP Publishing, University of Toronto Press. Given China's emerging role in the world and its current fraught relationship with Canada, Living with China provides a historic perspective, a detailed description of China's economic and political strategy, as well as strong policy recommendations for a path forward. The Wealth of First Nations, written by Tom Flanagan, published by Fraser Institute. Clearly directed to the key issues of how to improve the economic and social well-being of First Nations. The Wealth of First Nations is a valuable addition to the debate and should promote discussion and dialogue on how to move forward to balance economic development and government investment. Breakdown, The Pipeline Debate and the Threat to Canada's Future, written by Dennis McConaughey, published by Dundurn Press. Breakdown addresses arguably one of the most contentious and consequential set of policy issues facing Canada today: the nexus of resource development, climate change, Indigenous rights, and Alberta alienation. Breakdown is well researched, balanced, and outlines several pragmatic strategies to help Canada find a way through these issues. The Tangled Garden, a Canadian culture manifesto for the digital age, written by Richard Stursberg with Stephen Armstrong, published by James Lorimer and Company Limited. The issue of ensuring that Canadian culture survives the technological change in the production and distribution of digital content is front and center in policy debate in Parliament. The Tangled Garden paints a very dim portrait of the status quo and conveys a sense of urgent need for policy action to level the playing field. This is your Donner Prize shortlist for 2019-2020. Empty Planet, The Shock of Global Population Decline, written by Daryl Bricker and John Ibbotson. Daryl Bricker is an author, public speaker, political commentator, and CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs. John Ibbotson is a columnist for the Globe and Mail, having served as bureau chief in both Ottawa and Washington, D.C. Author of several books, his 2005 book, The Polite Revolution, was shortlisted for the Donner Prize.
Empty Planet seeks to demonstrate that the predictions of the United Nations that our population is exploding, it will go to 11 billion by the end of the century, all those assumptions are wrong.
The world's population isn't going to continue to expand forever.
In fact, because of steadily decreasing fertility in the developing world as well as the developed, it's going to top out somewhere around 9 billion in the middle of the century and then start to go down.
This is very contrary to what a lot of demographers have been arguing, particularly the United Nations. So we were really intrigued by the idea of dealing with a topic that a lot of people out there just assume is correct. The answer to the question is correct, but actually the answer is incorrect.
We had both read the relevant academic literature, but what we both agreed was we needed to get the argument out because there were too many people who didn't understand that argument.
This is going to be the most important development we're probably going to see this century, and it was a story that was really worth telling. And it combined both of our expertise, John's expertise as a reporter and my expertise as a statistician and an understanding of population trends.
The takeaways economically are not encouraging because you have fewer people every year being born, which means you have a smaller society every year, which means you have a smaller economy every year. So more old people depending on fewer young people every year. That's not going to be healthy.
But the other impact that it's going to have, and you're having very little conversation about this today, is on fertility. And again, a counterintuitive thing is that when people say, for example, through a snowstorm or a power outage or some other reason for a shutdown, are forced to stay home, the expectation is that what we're going to have is a lot of kids produced. Actually, that doesn't happen. In fact, the exact opposite happens.
All the evidence suggests that an economic downturn produces a long-term suppression of fertility rates. We saw that happen in the economic recession of 08-09, and I expect we're going to see it happen in this recession big time.
Well, John and I wrote this book for a popular audience, and we wrote it for a global audience. Basically, we looked at anybody as being a potential reader.
Well, of course, we would like politicians and planners and academics and demographers and statisticians to read our book because we think that there are decisions that we have to make about how many schools we build versus how many long-term care facilities we build.
What we really want people to get out of the book is that this is the single biggest thing that's going to be happening this century. And anything else that happens around it is really going to be affected by the population change that we're talking about here. It's going to change just about everything that has to do with anything related to the society and the economy. So these are the building blocks for understanding what our future is going to be.
Daryl and I are very grateful to the Donner Foundation and the jury for shortlisting Empty Planet this year. We are both very grateful to our agent, John Pierce, who has worked with us now on 2 different books, to Douglas Pepper and to everyone at McClellan & Stewart, who were the lead publishers on the book, and to publishers from China, the United States, Britain, around the world, who have translated the book and produced it in their own markets.
This project wouldn't have come to fruition without the real persistence of our agent, John Pierce at Westwood. He really brought this together and brought the project home. Also, we had 3 major publishers who really worked on this, plus some international publishers. And it was Doug Pepper from Random House here in Canada, it was Tom Asker from Little Brown in the UK, and Emma Barry from Crown in the United States really drove this project. All of my colleagues at Ipsos, who I visited as I traveled around the world and interviewed, but most importantly, they took time on my weekends and my evenings away from my wife Nina and my daughter Emily, and they more than anybody are responsible for my ability to be able to create this book. So I want to thank them, and I certainly dedicated my contribution to the book to both of them.
Empty Planet: The Shock of Global Population Decline. Published by Signal, McClellan & Stewart. The Donner Canadian Foundation thanks WHYTE for its generous support. Living with China, A Middle Power Finds Its Way, written by Wendy Dobson. Wendy Dobson is a professor emerita of Rotman School, U of T, teaching international business and Canadian public policy. She has published in English and Mandarin on the Chinese economy, Chinese financial system, and Chinese innovation.
I decided to write this book because even though China is one of our largest trading partners, we don't understand it very well. As China has become a global player, Canada lacks a strategy. But the key message is short and durable. Canadians must learn to live with China. China's different. We've assumed that as it developed, it would become more like us. Instead, President Xi Jinping leads with a model of authoritarian state capitalism and a remarkable record of economic growth and development. President Xi is playing a long game that's deeply rooted in Chinese history. The chaotic US administration has turned inward. Xi Jinping sees this as an opportunity to fill the leadership vacuum. But those ambitions are also feeding American mistrust and a struggle for dominance in what could become a new Cold War if it's not carefully managed. But some recent studies suggest that with the dynamic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, the rising tensions between China and the US, and President Xi's increasing centralization of his power, he may overreach. China's rise is a central geoeconomic issue of our time. The book presents a forward-looking and focused guide to an ambitious, assertive China, and as the pandemic has shown, one that's globally connected and interdependent, affecting our daily lives and even our health. I'm often asked why people should read this book. I'd say because it aims to provide a balanced analysis. Canadians, particularly in Ottawa, but also at the provincial level, need to think about a strategy. To create a strategic context, I focus first on China's economy and institutions. Many studies and conferences are increasingly critical of China, but my focus is on both the potential strengths and the weaknesses of the bilateral relationship. I'd like to conclude by thanking the Donner Canadian Foundation, the Donner Prize jury, and many people and organizations who've engaged in publishing this book. Special thanks go to my colleagues at the University of Toronto School of Management and to Paul Evans at UBC for valuable collaboration. More thanks too to Jennifer DiDomenico at the University of Toronto Press, who was my publisher, and to editor Barry Norris for his expert production of the volume.
Living with China, A Middle Power Finds Its Way, published by Rotman UTP Publishing, University of Toronto Press. The Wealth of First Nations, written by Tom Flanagan. Tom Flanagan is a professor emeritus of political science and distinguished fellow at the School of Public Policy, University of Calgary.
This book is about the conditions for prosperity for First Nations. This is recognized as one of the biggest public policy challenges for Canada, is how First Nations can achieve a higher standard of living. And this book reviews what First Nations have done for themselves to attain that goal. I wrote the book because I wanted to bring together about 10 years of research that I had conducted on the conditions for Indigenous prosperity. I had published probably about a dozen different papers in think tank outlets online. I wanted to put it together into a more coherent and overall treatment. It's widely recognized that the Indigenous standard of living is lower than that of most other Canadians, and what can be done about it? Well, what I wanted to study was what Indigenous people themselves are doing about it. Some First Nations are doing much better than others. So I wanted to find out what the successful ones are doing that is giving them a higher standard of living. The biggest thing I found was that for them to succeed, government has to get out of the way. The most important factors have been relaxations in the Indian Act, which give First Nations more latitude to chart their own course. For First Nations leaders, I think reading this book will give them a stronger idea of what their colleagues are doing. It may help them to do a better job for their own people. It's important for the public to understand what works and what doesn't work so that they won't be led into supporting false options. And for policymakers, the main lesson is that First Nations are doing this for themselves and that Canadian policymakers have to give them the room to succeed. I'm glad I published the book when I did because I think it helps to make some information available about what will work and what won't work. Well, I certainly would like to thank the research institutes that have supported my work over the years. The Fraser Institute, the Frontier Center for Public Policy, and in a somewhat smaller way, the Atlantic Institute for Market Studies. But I couldn't have done the work without the financial and logistical support I got from these organizations. And beyond that, I'd like to thank the people that helped. This is really a collective project because I had the help of young research assistants there are too many to name, but these people made it possible for the research to be done. And then finally, the peer review system, which is used by think tanks similar to that used by university presses. And this was a source of a lot of useful suggestions. We're talking here a couple of dozen readers. It's too many to name, but I'm certainly grateful to everybody who's contributed to what is fundamentally a group project, although I helped pen on it.
The Wealth of First Nations, published by Fraser Institute. Mesdames et Messieurs, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the chair of the Donner Prize jury, Mr. David Dodge.
Bonjour à tous. Bienvenue à la célébration de 22e présentation du Prix Donner. It has been my privilege to chair the jury again this year and to have the opportunity to read so many interesting books that were submitted for the prize. Real books with careful, in-depth probing of public policy issues facing Canada and the world. Although it continues to be a rough environment for Canadian publishers, the quantity and quality of books submitted this year is evidence that there's no need yet to toll the death knell for the rigorous analysis that the Donner Foundation champions through its support of this prize. I commend the writers that made the effort to produce these probing analyses of public policy issues, and I take my hat off to the publishers that offer writers a venue for their work. As jury chair, I've had the pleasure of working with 4 dedicated, thoughtful, critical thinkers this year. Peter Nicholson from Nova Scotia, again this year, brings to the jury experience gained from a wide range of posts in government, business, science, and higher education. Jean-Marie Dufour from McGill University brings his experience as an academic economist, a policy analyst, an advisor to governments and to the Bank of Canada. Brenda EATON from Victoria, BC, contributes her long experience as Deputy Minister in various BC departments and more recently as a corporate director. And finally, from Calgary, Alberta, joining the jury for the first time this year, Elizabeth Cannon brings her long experience as a researcher, an engineer, a scientific advisor, former president of the University of Calgary, and advocate for the role of women in science. You can find online complete bios of all 5 of us on the jury. As a jury, our goal is to draw attention to the books that help inform current policy debate. This year, our shortlisted books not only achieve that goal, but also provide some imaginative and very practical suggestions as to how our public institutions might convert good policy into operational practice. In closing, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank the authors of all the books submitted. As I said, we had to set aside many outstanding books in choosing our list of 5. And finally, on behalf of the jury, I congratulate the shortlisted authors, and particularly the author or authors of the winning book, which will be announced very soon. Thank you very much.
Breakdown, the pipeline debate and the threat to Canada's future. Written by Dennis McConaughey. Dennis McConaughey is a Canadian energy executive who has nearly 40 years of industry experience in infrastructure development and is the author of Dysfunction, Canada After Keystone XL.
Breakdown is a book that tries to tackle the subject of how can Canada reconcile its ambitions to have a credible and proportionate climate policy while at the same time maintaining and growing the economic contribution from hydrocarbons, one of the great natural endowments it has had. And this book is taking on the experiences over the last 5 years in this country, where trying to find that balance has largely been very problematic, very difficult for the country, very divisive. This book chronicles that history, and at the same time tries to offer constructive suggestions as to how this country can actually achieve credible climate policy based primarily on carbon pricing, while at the same time adjusting its regulatory and legal processes in order to still be able to capture its hydrocarbon opportunities. All of that is the great Canadian challenge, and that is what this book is trying to constructively explore. Breakdown, I think, is even more relevant in 2020 than it even was when it was released in 2019. In a post-COVID world, Canada is going to be struggling to re-energize its economy, restore economic activity across all sectors. And so it becomes especially vital that all of Canada's existing competitive advantages are fully utilized. So how does Canada do that responsibly while at the same time wanting to make a constructive and morally justified contribution to dealing with the global climate risk? How does Canada find a balance between its economic interests and credible and proportionate climate policy? And of course, it would be my hope that those responsible in our country for policy, I would very much hope they would look at the recommendations in Breakdown, take them to heart, and at the very least have a vigorous discussion of those specific recommendations. I'd like to thank, for Breakdown, obviously Dundurn Press for their continuing support and giving me the opportunity to write this second book. I want to also acknowledge the contributions of Naomi Lewis, helping my English be as accessible as possible, and without saying my family, most importantly Maureen, in terms of her steadfast support. But I'd also like to thank an array of professional colleagues over the last years who have stimulated my thinking on these issues. I very much want to acknowledge the contribution in the generation of this book from those various people that I've had the privilege of working with, competing with, and then sometimes arguing with about the appropriateness of policy.
Breakdown: The Pipeline Debate and the Threat to Canada's Future. Published by Dundurn Press. The Tangled Garden, a Canadian cultural manifesto for the digital age, written by Richard Stursberg with Stephen Armstrong. Richard Stursberg, a career broadcaster, has served as Executive Director of Telefilm and Head of English Language Services at the CBC. He is currently President of PEN Canada.
Well, The Tangled Garden is about the existential crisis that Canada is currently going through. Every government, except for the last two, the Harper government and the Trudeau government, have understood something fundamental about the country, which is that if there's going to be a country separate from the United States, that it has to have its own media. It has to have an opportunity to be able to have its own news, its own stories, its own novels, its own films, its own sense of humor, and for Canadians to be able to see and hear these things. What's happened over the course of the last little while is that the media industries, the two biggest ones, the newspaper industries and the television industries, are in a state of collapse. They are in a state of collapse so that they're all losing money. Many of them have already gone bankrupt. But the curious thing is that the government has done effectively nothing about it. And the danger that arises is that if we do not act, we will become effectively absorbed into the cultural ecosystem of the United States. I spent all my life pretty much in these businesses, financing Canadian TV shows and Canadian movies, running the CBC, running Telefilm, working in the cable TV industry. And for me, these businesses were fundamental to the identity of the country. And when I saw what was happening in terms of their ongoing collapse and the implications of that for us as a country, I was sufficiently worried about it that I thought it was really important to write a book explaining what was going on and what it is that we could do about it. The root of the problem is the emergence of gigantic, unregulated American media companies in Canada. And by this I mean everything from Facebook and Google through Netflix and Disney+. They operate in this country, they compete for ad revenue against the traditional media, and they compete for audiences, but they make no contribution back to the Canadian cultural ecosystem. They pay no tax, they commission no Canadian shows, they have no obligations. With the emergence of COVID, what's happened is that they have taken more, and it has accelerated the speed at which they have taken more of the revenues away from the traditional Canadian media companies. Clearly, the most important people to read it are policymakers of one variety or another, and politicians, and people in the media businesses. Everybody who's interested in maintaining our country as a distinct country should read the book. I've tried to write it in a way where it's not technical, difficult, or full of strange regulatory language, but I hope it's funny, and it's moving, and it's clear. So I'd like it to be part of the broader national conversation on who we are and who we want to be. This is not a difficult subject to deal with. It does not require new legislation, and properly handled, it does not require the expenditure of new money. There are simple ways of dealing with this problem to ensure that we have a country in the future. So I'd like to thank Stephen Armstrong. Stephen Armstrong worked on the book with me. He's a brilliant guy and he did a terrific job. I'd like to thank the people who read the book from me and who provided comment, Catherine Tate, Claude Gallipeau, Heaton Dyer. I'd obviously like to thank Jim Lorimer and Lorimer Publishing for actually having produced the book and done a beautiful job. I'd like clearly to thank the Donner Foundation. And the other thing I would just say is the book is actually dedicated to my small, almost 2-year-old grandson Clement, because I want him to grow up in a country that is recognizable as Canada.
The Tangled Garden, a Canadian culture manifesto for the digital age, published by James Lorimer and Company Limited.
As you can see, the jury has selected a stellar field this year, and we hope that the spotlight of the Donner Prize shortlist will help spread the word on these great books. And now, the winner of the 2019-2020 Donner Prize for Public Policy is Breakdown: The Pipeline Debate and the Threat to Canada's Future. Congratulations to Dennis McConaughey and to his publishers at Dundurn Press.
Let me say at the outset, I'm very humbled and surprised that I have won this prize. I am really very appreciative that the Donner Foundation was willing to shortlist me, and obviously I'm just very elated that the book has received this prize. And I'm just so pleased that the opportunity of getting these ideas that I were able to put in the book more exposure. I very much appreciate the fact that I've won this prize. I'd like to also just at this time acknowledge again the people that helped me through the process of creating this book, both my family, my professional colleagues, my other supporters. I feel at this time very humbled and very lucky. So thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us today, and congratulations again to Dennis McConaughey. Dennis, the check is in the mail. As I mentioned earlier, this year the Donner Canadian Foundation celebrates an amazing 70 years of supporting public policy research and education, wildlife and environmental causes, human rights, and social service organizations. It's been my privilege to be involved with the Donner Canadian Foundation for 30 years as a governor and for the last 6 years as chair. This is my final Donner Prize presentation, and as I step down and hand the reins to the incoming chair, who will be announced shortly, I'd like to thank our staff at the foundation, Naylor and Associates for organizing and reorganizing us this year, and Creative Harbor for this very effective presentation. Thanks for watching.